This is an important part of experimental design. I thought it would be helpful to have a completely separate session on sample size calculation. So over the next 45 minutes or so, I'm just going to talk about methods for calculating sample size to give you a feel for what goes into that. That's just a repeat of one of the slides you've already seen. It's important that your sample size is large enough. So if there's an effect of a size worth knowing about, the study will find it, hopefully, as statistically significant, and you'll have a good chance of doing that. But what you want to guard against is having your sample size unnecessarily large. You don't really want to waste time, animals or resources, and in particular animals is becoming more important ethically, not to waste animals, not to have too many, not to have too few either, because if you've got a low chance of detecting a result, then you're not just wasting a few animals, you're not just done a few too many, you're wasting the whole experiment and all the animals that were used in the experiment. So it's quite an important consideration. And now that it's become part of the, there's a study form that needs to be completed in Roslin whenever a new study involving animals has got to be carried out. We're now asking for more justification of numbers of animals, so it's becoming more important for animal studies particularly. So thinking about what I would say were bad ways to determine sample size, but nevertheless it's still something that people say to me a lot. They've always used this number of mice in the past, that's what they're going to do again. They've got a lot of significant results, so this number of mice can give the result that we want, so why shouldn't we do that again? And you're sort of challenged to try and justify why you should suit the number of animals to the particular experiment. Another argument is everyone uses this number. I can only afford this number. We've got practical restraints on the experiment, so I'm afraid that's all we can do. These are not really good ways to determine your sample size. Before I go into the actual calculations, it's probably worth just getting out of the way, and I said this in the last session, but sample size calculation, there are some situations where it's not actually necessary, well certainly not necessary to do it in the way I'm going to consider, which is to obtain statistical significance, and that's when the main objective of study isn't to get a statistically significant result. It might be to do a pilot study, for example, just check out the procedures for the experiment. You might not know how variable the data are, which is an essential ingredient for sample size calculation. So it might be worthwhile doing a small study just to get a feel for how variable the measurements are. Sometimes studies are done to demonstrate a concept. If we do this, can I get an example with this genotype of such and such happening? And that's another reason to do a study, but you're not seeking to get statistical significance. However, I still think it's important to sort of try and justify, particularly in animal studies, how many you're using in some way, and it might be that you can do some kind of calculation, for example, to think of probabilities that you might get something happening with different numbers of animals, even if you're not aiming to achieve statistical significance. This is with the new question on the study form about justifying numbers of animals. People have sometimes worried and said, well, I'm not looking at statistical significance, how can I do a power calculation? And in those cases, sometimes it's the case that they don't need to do one. So. But assuming you're doing a study and you want to get a statistically significant result, then you ideally would do a sample size calculation. And so I just want to sort of go through the main factors that go into that, the key factors. The first one, which I think is often the hardest one people find to get their heads around, is the size of the difference that you want your study to be able to detect. And sometimes that's given by delta, which is a Greek symbol in the formulae. And people will say to me, well, I don't know what size of difference I'm going to get. But that doesn't really matter. It's what size of difference would be important if it occurred. For example, a 50% decrease in gene expression, is that, if that was the true underlying effect, would you want your study to be able to show that? If it was only 20%, would it be important for your study to show that? So that's something you need to decide in advance, what's important. If the difference was there, would I want to be able to detect it in the study? So that's not something that you need to have measured before. You just need to sort of know what you would like to see if it was there. Significance level, I mean, usually that's just taken to be the 5% significance level, seen as what you need for statistical significance, so you don't usually need to think any more about that. The next concept, which is specific to sample size calculation, is the power. That's often denoted by the Greek symbol beta. So the power is that it's the chance of detecting a statistically significant result if you've got this size of difference. So if the true underlying decrease in gene expression, for example, was 50%, and I do my study with this many animals, how likely am I to be able to get a significant result? Because of course, you never know exactly what's going to happen in your experiment. There's random variability. You want to have a good chance of getting that significant result. And typically, the power people use is 80% or 90%. So it's seen that a study is satisfactory if you've got 80 or 90% chance of getting your result as significant. If you go much less than 80%, you might argue, well, is the study really worth doing if I've only got 50% chance of achieving statistical significance? There's 50-50 that all my study and possibly animals are going to have been wasted. And the thing you will have to put into the calculation that can be quite hard to get, given you haven't done your study, is you want to measure the variability of the data. So you'll need the standard deviation of the data. But quite often, if it's a measurement, if your primary endpoint is a measurement that's been taken in other studies, in similar situations, even if it's not your study, there'll be, in the literature, you might be able to find details of what the standard deviation is. Even if it's just a sort of plot where, with error bars, you can get a sort of rough estimate of what that is. And that's often better than just doing nothing at all, rather than saying, I just don't have any estimates of the standard deviation, I can't do a sample size calculation. You can be sort of creative in using what's available in publications if you don't have that estimate from previous studies yourself. Or even if it's a previous study in a slightly different situation, it can still be a valid estimate of a standard deviation to incorporate. And quite often standard deviations are given by the Greek symbol sigma, so it's worth getting used to these symbols because they go into the formulae. So they're the 4 ingredients that go into sample size calculation. So the first one you just need to think about. Second to significance level is usually obvious. The power, you just need to decide, do I want to be, how certain you want to be about getting your significant result, and then you do need an estimate of the standard deviation of your primary endpoint.